Hello and welcome to The Inquisitive Investor. I'm your host, Parijat Garg, and in this show, we explore how the smartest investors and entrepreneurs think about business, markets, strategy, and process that help them succeed at what they do. My guest today is Rohit Goyal. Rohit is an alumnus of IIT Bombay, the co-founder of Indian crypto exchange Mudrex, and of a decentralized finance or DeFi business called Mesh Finance. A recent statistic suggests that cryptocurrency adoption in the world is growing at a massive 800% per annum. The last time such rapid adoption took place was with the internet itself in the 1990s. And yet, a very large number of us still don't understand the crypto ecosystem, or worse, think it's basically just a Ponzi scheme. I've invited Rohit for a multi-part series to help us non-geeks understand the space better before we write it all off as a scam. In this episode, we talk about crypto exchanges, how you can earn crypto instead of just buying it, how to figure out which cryptocurrencies are likely to be meaningful and which ones are likely to fail, and the mechanics and costs of crypto mining. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Rohit Goyal. Hi, Rohit. Welcome to the show. Um, Rohit, I want to start today with just your background, just getting our audience to sort of understand your background and how you've gotten here, right? So you graduated from IIT Bombay in 2012 with a degree in civil engineering, and yet early in 2013 you started a company called PaxPlay, which built mobile games, which was like I think the real hot thing at that time. And so you're good at catching trends, I suppose. And then 2017, early in 2017, I understand you then actually moved into the crypto space, which is again very, very early for the Indian ecosystem, right? And you started with some of your friends, you started Mudrex, a crypto exchange. And now very recently, you've also started another project. I don't know if I should even call it a company, Mesh Finance. So I just want to understand what makes somebody go from civil engineering into mobile gaming, and then how do you quickly pick up this trend, and how do you so quickly end up in the crypto space?
Yeah, first of all, thanks. I'm really excited like having this conversation. I'll call myself as builder. I just get excited building things. Also, I'm a curious person, so that gets me into newer things, like whatever trends are coming up. I get curious about like what are the things that is coming up. So my journey has been building journey has started in 2010, somewhere around 2010, actually, when I was still in my second year of graduation. So back then I started this project called booksmenu.com, and I was trying to create Goodreads. Back then Goodreads was very small, and this was just a side project, like just an experiment for me. I just wanted to learn web design basically. So I needed something using which I can learn web design, and I learn things by building. So I started that. Obviously, I never thought of it from a venture perspective. Then my first real venture was called sabjiwala.com, which was by end of 2010. So that was one of the first Indian e-commerce grocery venture. So I started building that with a couple of my seniors from IIT Bombay. And while I was building that, I realized a couple of things about myself. First, I was never passionate about operations, and grocery business is operations heavy. Second, I was very enthusiastic about the technology itself and the consumers. Like I can I like to claim that I understand consumer psychology. So with that, first I decided, okay, this is not something where I can spend 10 years of my life. So I moved on from Sabjiwala, and then I graduated in 2012. I tried multiple things in between them, just like being a builder gene. And by end of 2012, I started my second proper venture called PaxPlay, which was into mobile games. So scaled that venture to 3 million users, completely bootstrapped. And while I was building that, I landed up on Bitcoin white paper via a couple of friends, somewhere around January 2017. And I think that was the time I read this book, Sapiens, as well. So this is kind of connected the dots. I understood money for the first time. I understood human coordination power, like what makes humans special compared to other species, not just Homo species, but like any other animal, for an example. And with that, I got this understanding like this is something really, really big. This is going to change humanity on a very different level. And we have been able to progress because we can coordinate in a bigger level of bigger number of people. Like early on, probably we could coordinate in 50 people. Then we learned how to coordinate within like 500 people. Now we are going into a world where we can probably coordinate between hundreds of thousands of people. And that's how I saw Bitcoin and the whole crypto revolution. And with that understanding, it naturally happened that I started spending 7-8 hours a day just reading about what was happening into the space. Almost everything was a white paper other than Bitcoin and Ethereum by that point of time. But I got curious. I just wanted to learn what are the possibilities out there. And I kind of did that very naturally while I was still running my gaming company. So once I realized that I'm spending this 8-9 hours a day just learning about this thing, that's when I realized that this is where I want to build the next thing. And that's when I got a couple of my co-founders who were my friends from last 10 years, and we started Mudrex.
Okay. So you are a serial entrepreneur, clearly, like this is your 4th or 5th venture now.
Yeah, I'll call serial builder maybe. So
Okay.
let's call it that.
Yeah, and yeah, brilliant. I don't think I've heard of anybody talk about Sapiens as an inspiration for the Bitcoin revolution. But I see that point, right? Stories matter. I think that's Bitcoin is so much about what we really collectively believe. Interesting. So it's basically your tendency to tinker that has led you so quickly into this space.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Perfect. So are there others like you in India? Are there others who are building crypto companies? What's happening? Just walk me through the landscape.
Yeah, so I think there are many like me. Some of them would be like just hackers building things, sitting in a room from a hostel room, maybe. Some of them are building from tier 3 cities. So in 2017, I will say the landscape in India was not that mature. In fact, if you remember, if you were catching on the space, like 2017 was the period known for the ICO period, when a lot of projects were raising funds based on just a narrative, based on just a story on a white paper. So there were really no products. And I remember back then, it used to be pretty popular that if the team is Indian, it is going to be a scam. It was pretty clear, basically. And like when we were starting Mudrex, we deliberately didn't put team for a decent amount of time until we actually got into Y Combinator, which was a stamp of trust and like credibility. So I think from there, now we have evolved to a place where if I meet random 100 people in this space today, 80 of them are Indian origin, and at least 40 to 50% of them are building from India. So that's a huge change, and a lot of credible projects are getting built from India these days. Polygon was one project which started in 2017, 2018, which everyone knows today. But other than that, there are different companies like Bionomy. There are companies who are solving for staking. There are companies who are building decentralized exchange, decentralized lending, borrowing on top of Polygon. So the whole space is widespread now. Also, like, because crypto as a gene is a very open source development, many of these doesn't exist as a company. Many of these exist as contributor base. So like, for an example, SushiSwap is one project, which is just a group of people building this as open source contributors. And many of those core contributors are from India. So you can say like India is actually building on the forefront of blockchain today.
Okay, that's very interesting. And there were a lot of terms, by the way, that you've thrown into that brief explanation. SushiSwap, that sounds like an interesting thing. We'll get to that. And of course, everybody's heard of the ICOs. But just very quickly, why is it that you think there are so many people building these projects? Why is such a large percentage of people from India in this space?
Yeah, so this is my personal thesis. So Indians have been always good at mathematics and programming. As we all know, like we have been popular in terms of brain drain. Most of the talent was going to US in software companies. So crypto brought crypto economics where you can build from anywhere. So like you don't have to go to a place to get capital. So capital became remote because it's digital. And like your efforts can get rewarded in a much efficient way within the crypto ecosystem. So you can consider crypto is open source development with right economics behind it. Imagine Ubuntu is one of the most used open source OS or operating system, and many contributors just develop it for free. Imagine if you could actually reward all the contributors in some economic way, give them some piece of this network, how quickly Ubuntu can evolve into one of the biggest OS network out there. So that is what is changing. So crypto is bringing economics, it is bringing capital, and that's why Indians are getting into it, because like it is something like it is meant for Indians as a programmer native country.
Okay. You're basically saying now it's easy to monetize the programming skill that we've had all along.
Exactly. And also this space is all about programming, and like I think India has the biggest programming talent pool out there.
Right. So in terms of monetization, would you say NFTs are something similar? I mean, you mentioned ICOs, and people, like you said, most people think most ICOs were scam. Is that what's happening in NFTs? Are NFTs scams? What is it? How is it related to, Bitcoin? Are they related, not related? Sort of explain for the audience what that is.
Yeah. So first, I like to clarify, like, I don't think ICOs were scam. I will say ICOs were a transition period. Like we were in the experimental mode and ICO was the first experiment. And now we have moved to better models of doing things in a way where you can't scam people. You can't take money from someone and run away. And that is what was happening from ICO. So ICO showed us a way that capital can be raised from public and in a more decentralized way. So everyone has access to the newer opportunities. But at the same time, ICO brought bad actors where people could just scam people by showing wrong promises. Now industry has improved from that perspective. Now people look for things which are real. So with that, now we have evolved into two categories, which I have seen. One is DeFi, decentralized finance, and obviously we can talk about that later. Second is NFT, which is very recent. So what is NFT? It's basically ownership. So what Ethereum solved was you can have a ledger which no one can change. And that was focused on money first. Like if you have $10, I have $10. If you have 10 rupees, I have 10 rupees. Like it's all registered on a blockchain database, which no one can change. But there are many other data which you want immutability for. So for an example, land registry. Land is known for dispute. I'm sure you'll be familiar with that. Like two parties can come and claim that they both own the same land. While that cannot be true, only one of them will actually own the land. But they will both have different form of document in some way. And that's why it goes into dispute. So NFTs are a way to store data where you can represent ownership. So this is simple, like one NFT is one, you hold ownership of something. So when you have $10, there is no ownership of the $10. Like your $10 and my $10 is the same thing. But if I have a land and you have a land, both of those lands are different. And that's what NFT mean on a fundamental level. Now that same concept applies to art. So you can hold a digital art and you can prove that this art is owned by you only. Similarly, music, for an example, music can be written as an NFT, can be distributed as an NFT, where the artist owns the art. Then it can represent multiple other things like insurance contracts or like a contract between a company A to company B. So NFT expands across this whole universe. It touches multiple different industries.
All right. So there are a bunch of concepts here, but the important one being, what is the notion of, so even say if you and I set up an NFT that says that I own a certain piece of land, you still need some government to enforce that right, that contract, right? So given that the whole crypto ecosystem right now has pretty much no government backing anywhere in the world, how does that work? Is this just an experiment right now to prove that this thing can work if there is government backing, or is there more to it?
Yeah. So first, I will say, and all of this might sound too futuristic, by the way. So the whole concept of building something on blockchain is trustlessness. That you can trust something without trusting an entity, without like having the power from an entity, without a stamp from an entity or an organization. So today, you need government to make sure that they are the one who is providing that trust, because like there is no other way of making sure like who owns this land, and it's actually the government agencies who will make sure you own this land. In case of blockchain, we are replacing with a trustless network where you don't actually need any organization like a government to say that this piece is owned by you. This is, you can consider it like as all humans, we collaboratively decided that this land is owned by Pari and not Rohit. So it is going beyond that. We are going into a society where we don't have to rely on government agencies or institutions for ownership, for truth of data.
Right. So I'm going to just make a statement and then we'll move on, because I know that's going to get complicated. One is just the record that I own a piece of land.
Yeah.
But if you were to actually physically go and occupy that land, I will still need some force or authority to say, look, no, there is on the blockchain, it says Parijat owns this land, therefore you, Rohit, should get off that land, right? So
Yeah.
that is not, I'm assuming that is not a solved problem yet.
Not today, for sure. Yeah. But it makes the government's job easy, or any institution's job easy, to prove that this land is owned by me. And now you can use law enforcement to actually make sure that the other person is not claiming that land anymore, because now the agency has seen that, okay, Rohit has the proof that he owns the land.
All right. So it's solving one piece of the problem for today.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, I'll move on from NFTs, because I think we'll have to do an entire episode separately to talk about that stuff. So switching to the other aspect you mentioned, right? ICOs, people got scammed, people took money and they just ran away. Very related to that is the question that, you know, there are now lots of exchanges where people can go and buy crypto, right? You could buy Bitcoin, Ether, you could buy the stable coins, etc. You know, what I did recently was I set up a wallet and I tried to reach out to some of my friends who've been investing, right? And I said, hey, you know, why don't you transfer, let's say, $100 worth of Ether, because I need it for something. You know, you've got, this is decentralized in some ways, right? So you don't need an intermediary. They should be able to transfer it. And they've been investing. But when I said, hey, can you send me the money? Their first reaction was, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And then when they sat down and they, you know, just tried to do it, they realized that they don't really have the money, right? It's in the exchange. They don't have it in their wallets, so to speak. So is that healthy? And, you know, should people be keeping the money in the exchanges? Because a lot of exchanges got shut down, right? Because of various reasons. We don't know if it's fraud, there were accidents, and, you know, money got lost in some ways. So is it healthy to leave money in exchanges? Should you be moving it to a wallet? What even is a wallet? Talk about that.
Yeah. So first, let me break down exchanges. So there might be two kind of exchanges a user might be using. First set of exchange let you withdraw your crypto assets, and another set of exchanges doesn't let you withdraw your crypto assets. And the example is Robinhood is somewhere like where you can buy Bitcoin, but you cannot withdraw your Bitcoin out of Robinhood. And Coinbase is an exchange where you can buy Bitcoin. At the same time, you can transfer your Bitcoin to any other Bitcoin address. So even if someone is using an exchange, I will highly recommend using an exchange which lets you at least withdraw your crypto assets. Second difference between crypto wallets, the decentralized wallets versus exchanges. In case of an exchange, consider them as your bank. So when you have your funds in your bank, your money is actually with the bank, and you just ask bank for the permission to move your money from one place to another place. So in this case, the money is actually held by bank. That means you are trusting the bank with your money. Now, unfortunately, that might be cases where bank lends this money to bad actors. They end up losing this money. As a result, you end up losing this money. So there might be these kind of risks. Second, all the time when you are transferring, there might be conditions like, okay, bank doesn't work at, let's say, from 8 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock in the morning. So you are kind of dependent on the infrastructure of the bank itself. So these are the caveats of using an exchange. Like, consider an exchange like a crypto bank who is holding your crypto assets, And whenever you are transferring, you will need their permission to transfer. So for an example, most of the exchanges might have this rule that you cannot withdraw more than 2 Bitcoin in 24 hours. So these kind of conditions are arbitrarily set by these exchanges. In case of decentralized wallet, consider that as your physical wallet. So imagine like when you have 100 rupee note as the cash, the rupee note, when you have it, you really don't need any permission from anyone when you are giving it to someone. You just send it to someone, and only two of us has to know that, okay, I have given you 100 rupees and you know that you have received 100 rupees. I didn't ask for any bank for the permission to transfer that. So crypto wallets let you have the same experience in a digital way, where you can transfer your money to another person without asking for any permission from anyone. There is no limits. The limit is basically whatever amount you want to send, you can send that, like whether it is 2 Bitcoin or whether it is 100 Bitcoin. So that's the basic difference between like an exchange and a crypto wallet. And at the same time, when you are holding your asset in a crypto wallet, you own that money. So it basically means nobody is using your money on your behalf. So no one is lending your assets on your behalf. That means your money is always secure as long as your wallet is secure. So that's a basic difference. In terms of usability, there are pros and cons of using both. So in case of exchange, it might be easier from the transaction cost perspective, whenever you are sending money to someone or whenever you are exchanging from one asset to another asset. While if you are transferring or transacting using a decentralized wallet, you will be paying the blockchain fees. And depending on blockchain to blockchain, the fees could be very high.
Okay, so, but the whole point of crypto, as I understand it, was its decentralized nature, right? That you don't have to trust anybody.
Yeah.
So isn't keeping money, your crypto, with exchanges like anathema, right? It's practically against the ethos of the whole thing.
Exactly. So imagine like if your total net worth is let's say $100,000. So out of that $100,000, you will like to keep $90,000 in a decentralized wallet, which is safe, which is not at any risk from the exchange perspective. And you might need to have $10,000 in an exchange, which you might use on a frequent basis for trading, for an example. So like depending on use case, large amount of wealth you should always keep in the decentralized wallet, and some amount of capital you can keep on an exchange depending on your use case.
Okay. But I've heard disaster stories about people losing their wallets or losing keys to their wallets.
Yeah.
Is that a legitimate fear? What can one do to sort of avoid that?
Yeah, so it's definitely a legitimate fear. So when you are holding your assets in a decentralized exchange, in a decentralized wallet, you are basically taking responsibility of your wallet. That means you have to keep your keys secure. If someone get access to your keys, they can steal your funds. So number one is you have to keep your keys secure. The way to do that is either write it in a piece of paper, hide it somewhere, write it in like maybe 3 or 4 pieces of paper, give it to like a very close friend of yours or a family member, so that even if you lose your copy, you might go to that friend and can ask for that. But sometimes even that can be risky, like that you might not trust that friend. So another way of doing that is you can actually divide your key into 2 parts. So if the key is 16 digits, you can keep 8 digits, give it to one friend, and you can keep 8 digits, give it to another friend, and don't tell these friends that they both have the keys. So now that way you can always recover your keys and nobody actually have access to your funds. So there are different ways using which like you can make sure you are secured. Basic ways are obviously you can keep it in a safe drive, hard disk, etc. as well, which usually you should keep secure as well.
Still sounds a lot of work to me, but I think we'll at some point we'll talk about hardware wallets, etc.
Also, I think like so these are, by the way, like obvious problems of this space. These are the problems of today. There are new concepts getting designed in which this much cognitive load doesn't ended up on the user itself. So applications are getting built which solves all these problems where you don't really have to interact with the private keys yourself.
Okay, yeah, that's something that I would really like to hear about later, because I mean, if you're going to look at mass adoption, one of those things is just making it less scary to own this stuff, right? And talking about mass adoption, the other thing, let's say I've bought some Ether or Bitcoin, etc. I've got it in my wallet. What can I really use it for other than, let's say, lending or trading? Right? Can I actually buy stuff today, like in the real world? Where can I do that?
So in India, I hardly think so. And the reason for that is we don't have regulatory clarity yet. But on a global scale, many of the top companies actually accept crypto as payment. That includes Microsoft, that includes Starbucks, few of the flight companies. You can actually book flights. You can actually buy cars using your Bitcoin. So many companies are actually adopting crypto as payment. PayPal accepts crypto as well these days.
Okay, so you said Starbucks, right?
Yeah.
And I'm assuming they are accepting Bitcoins. And
yes.
So you're saying that I could walk into a Starbucks outlet and buy a $4 coffee with
exactly.
But are the transaction fees too high for that?
Yeah, so that's a caveat. But again, we are solving the space is solving those issues. So in case of Bitcoin, for an example, they are working on this concept called Lightning Network, where you are paying almost zero fees for micro transactions. So you can say, like, we are building solutions for micro transactions. There might be different solutions for medium-sized transactions, and only the large volume transaction you will end up doing on actual Bitcoin blockchain or Ethereum blockchain. And at the same time, these micro transactions have the same security as the core blockchain. They are just not as decentralized.
Okay, and is this Lightning Network, is that live today?
Yeah, it is live. So I'm not sure if you heard about this country, El Salvador, which ended up being the first country to accept Bitcoin as a medium of payment, as official currency. So they are doing it on a Lightning Network. Today, I think Lightning Network is doing close to like $500 million in the total value logged in the Lightning Network is close to $500 million.
Okay. So similarly, El Salvador, and they started the Chivo wallet or something that they have?
No, so they haven't started it. It's literally the open source developers who are building all these solutions. So basic difference is you are not settling all the transaction on the Bitcoin blockchain. Instead of that, what you are doing is you are creating a private channel. Let's say between you and me, I'm creating a channel, and for the 24-hour, whatever transaction we are doing, we just do it between each other. And at the end of the day, we settle those transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain. So now 100 transactions are getting settled using just one transaction on Bitcoin blockchain. So you can assume that what is the cost of one transaction is getting divided between 100 transactions. So that's the impact it is creating.
To be honest, this sounds to me the opposite direction of where banking has gone actually, right? So banking actually started with doing end-of-day settlements to getting NEFT and real-time settlements. And it seems blockchain is actually going the other way, where you had one-to-one immediate transactions and then you're going to a daily settlement. But hey, whatever works, I guess.
Yeah. So the core difference is like your underlying infrastructure is on the blockchain itself. So you can 100% with 100% surety, you can assume for settlement that there will be no error between settlement. And all you are doing is you are inheriting the security of the underlying network.
Okay. So it's not even unsafe during those 24 hours.
Yeah, exactly. So even that is decentralized, but let's say the whole Bitcoin blockchain could be hundreds of thousands of nodes. The Lightning Network within your circle might be 100 nodes. So it is still decentralized. It is still not something like you are trusting on just one person. You are still trusting 100 different nodes.
Okay. So help me understand this. So supposing I receive payment from you on the Lightning Network.
Yeah.
But I will not be able to use that money on the main blockchain or for system outside the Lightning Network until it is settled.
Yes. Right. And exactly for that reason, you will like to keep the amount of capital in Lightning Network, which you might want to use on a day-to-day basis. So imagine it as your Paytm wallet, for an example.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got a bank and then you've got a peer-to-peer wallet.
Exactly. Exactly.
All right. Okay, that's clarifying. Okay, so you can buy crypto, right? And obviously people have heard of mining crypto. Is there a way for me to earn crypto?
Yeah. So the best way to earn crypto is, first of all, like, crypto is all these different assets, digital assets, There are today probably more than 10,000 plus crypto assets. Most of them will be useless, but some of them are really useful. So what happens? So this is the evolution which happened from ICO era to now. So what people realized is that all these protocols. So for an example, now you have created decentralized money. Now you need to create applications on top of it. So like just like we have INR and then we have bank, which is built on top of INR. Bank. So consider banks as an application. The use case banks are solving is lending and borrowing, for an example. So similarly, now we are creating use cases. We are creating these financial primitives on top of blockchain, on top of the decentralized money. So the one of the protocol could be like, which is solving lending and borrowing. So the way these protocols get built is in an open source way. So you can be a contributor, like anywhere, if you are anywhere from anywhere, like you can live anywhere in the world. You can just go contribute to these protocols in any way you can contribute. That can include, you might help these protocols in terms of development, in terms of programming. If you are a designer, you can design for them. If you are a growth person, you can help them with growth strategies. If you are a researcher, you can help them with research. And as you contribute, these protocols reward you with their native tokens. So basically, you are investing your time and you are earning these native digital assets against your time. And that is what I was trying to mention before as well. Like the crypto economics are much more aligned with developers as well, because in the traditional world, when you are working for someone, the company gives you a fixed salary. So let's say you get 10 lakh rupees to work for 8 hours a day in a company. So nowhere there is correlation that whether you will end up producing 100 output or 10 output, your salary doesn't matter. Like these are not aligned. In this case, these are very much aligned. Whatever you will do as an input to these protocols, the community will decide, will figure out a way to reward you proportionally. And since now you are a contributor of piece, you own the piece of this network. As the network grows, your wealth itself grows as well substantially, then the cash itself. And that's how you can basically earn these digital currencies. And I think that is the reason many people are getting involved and working in this space today compared to like 3 years back. That's the progress we have seen from the ICO era to today.
So that sounds a lot like sweat equity, right? You join a startup
yes,
and you get
yes.
paid in
So, exactly. And we like you can say it's a scalable model of that. Like you can't do that with 500 people. You can't really give ESOPs to 500 people at day one. Here we have figured out a way you can do that. Also, it is liquid. In case of equity, probably most of the people, 80 or 90% of the early employees don't end up making any money out of their stocks because most of the companies fail. In this case, companies like the tokens get liquid like within 6 months, within 12 months. And like they can actually liquidate, they can actually make a living out of those tokens.
Okay. So that's actually a good lead into what I wanted to talk about in terms of investing, but actually this is also similar. Is like, there are so many projects, like you said, there are 10,000 different crypto assets today, right? So whether I'm an investor or whether I'm somebody who's going to contribute to a project, how do I determine, what do you look at to figure out whether a certain token, a certain crypto asset is likely to be valuable versus, even between say Ethereum and Bitcoin, and now there is Solana and there is, I think, Matic, and there's all these things. How does one think about what will or will not be valuable other than just the price action?
Yeah. So I think like, first of all, it becomes an individual decision at the end of the day. The way crypto is getting developed is by having a value system where the community believes that we should live in a bottom-up society instead of a top-down society. The difference between both is in bottom-up society, things start at the bottom layer, like where everyone is working together. They are figuring out what needs to be built, will use it, and the decision making is happening as a collective society. In a top-down approach, like for an example, in a company, the usual way it happens is there is a CEO who tells what needs to be built. He directs something, then it goes to the manager, then it goes to the lowest level of employee. So those are the differences. And that's why like the fundamental difference between crypto, like with crypto, what you are trying to do is you are trying to create a world where a lot of people can coordinate with each other in a trustful way, in a trustless way. So what happens with that is, first of all, you start looking at things that if this project is building these things, do they actually align with these values? Do they actually align with open source values, for an example? How loyal is the community? Like, are people coming to get cash rich kind of a scheme, or people are coming to build these things? Like, people are excited to build these things. So one way to look at is whatever developers are most excited about, whichever projects have the most contributor, you can say, base, that could be one of the metric to look for. So whichever project has best contributor base, the biggest number of contributors, that means more number of people are aligned with that mission, more number of people are aligned with that values. And since your values and mission are now aligned, and also I'm bringing the crypto economics of way to rewarding your efforts. Now, as a human, I will probably produce 10x better returns than I was producing at a company where my values were not aligned and where my economic incentives were not aligned. Do you follow me at this point?
I think I do. I'm just thinking about the mechanics of, let's say, somebody who doesn't understand programming, or how could I even begin to understand how many people are contributing to a project, for example? And where can I learn about any given project?
Yeah, so most of these projects build in public. So most of the projects will have their community page, which will be managing on this software called Discord. You can pretty much assume Discord is like Slack, but for open source communities. So if you'll join Discord of any of the protocols, you will get to know how many people are active there, how many people are talking about building things instead of just the price. And that's like one of the metric you can look for. That's a quality metric. Okay, at one Discord, you may see people are just asking like, what is the price? When is this gonna shoot up in price? And at one Discord, people will be talking about, hey, we can do this, we can build this, we can disrupt these industries. So that's the difference between two communities. So you will like to bet on the second one. The second is like, now we actually have real products out there. So especially like in decentralized finance, for an example, we are solving lending, borrowing, decentralized exchange. So you can really look at the metric, which are pretty much comparable to traditional finance. So all of these protocols have revenue. So you can look at the revenue. You can look at how much assets these protocols are managing. You can look at P/E ratios. You can look at their growth numbers, because everything is public. That's the power of blockchain. All the data is public. It's transparent. Nobody can actually change that data. So all these metrics can help you decide where to back.
So you used an interesting term, price to earnings. In the case of crypto, I don't think so. A lot of our audience is actually people from the traditional asset management industry.
Yeah.
So price to earnings. Wait, so I think you mentioned an exchange called SushiSwap, right? It's an exchange.
Yeah.
So let's say I want to find out what kind of volume gets traded on SushiSwap. How will I figure that out?
So you can actually just go to app.sushi.com and they will show it publicly on their UI. If you are a programmer, so first of all, like how you can know that the number shown on the website is correct, because the code itself is automated. So it is actually coming by pulling up number from the blockchain, Ethereum blockchain itself. So number is trustable because any programmer in the world can actually look and claim that number is correct. So if it will be forged, programmers will come and say, hey, this number is wrong. If you are not a programmer, you can basically trust on thousands of different programmers who can understand and who can make sure like this number is correct. So all the websites will show you like how much capital they are managing, or how much volume they are doing, or how much revenue they are making.
Okay. Interesting. I think that's something we'll probably have to put in the show notes to give some pointers on how to get these metrics, because I mean,
in fact, some of the protocols have started releasing quarterly reports as well now. It's just like your shareholder reports, where you show what has been the expenses, what has been the fixed cost, what has been the running cost, what has been the revenue, what is the profit, what is the PYV, like everything in detail.
So is there a place that most people in the crypto community trust to track these projects, and that is collating these reports, etc., or do I have to go to every project individually?
So for report, it's still not standardized, because to be honest, like most of the projects are less than 18 months old, and like it has just seen humongous progress. So even in 18 months, if you are able to produce these reports, like that's a like heads off to all those projects. Having said that, you can look at the numbers of at least the high level numbers. That includes how much capital they are managing and all of that. You like there is one website called DeFi Pulse, DeFipulse.com. So it tells you all the DeFi projects with how much capital they are actually managing.
Okay.
And you can segregate them in categories as well, like how many of them are into asset management, how many of them are into lending and borrowing, how many of them are exchanges.
Okay. I think that'll require a whole different discussion, or at least a resource that we'll have to put together.
Yeah.
Let me move on to just or rather come back to this thing you said that there are lots of Indians building projects. Is anybody in India building anything that's like a competitor to Ethereum? You mentioned Polygon. What exactly is that? Is that like Ethereum? Who's building it? What's happening there?
Yeah. So as far as my knowledge, nobody is building the competitor as such for Ethereum or Bitcoin. Polygon is a side chain of Ethereum. You can say Polygon is a supportive system of Ethereum. And what Polygon does is, as I explained to you about Lightning Network, in a philosophical way, not in the technical way, in a philosophical way, you can understand Polygon is the Lightning Network for Ethereum. So you can imagine like Bitcoin has again 100,000 nodes. So you copied the same blockchain, it's the same code, but this code is run by only 100 people now. So now since only 100 people need to approve, that suddenly you achieve transaction scalability. And since the code is same, the hash and all of that will be composable with Ethereum. It will be, the results will be same as it will be on Ethereum. And using that, like Polygon does all the transaction, and every half an hour, the final state, they merge with Ethereum. So again, you can consider that as a settlement time.
Okay. You used a word called composable. I just heard this a few days ago, and I've heard that composability is like the big new thing in crypto. I don't think our audience will be able to understand what you're talking about here.
Let me give you one simple example for that. So you have HDFC Bank, you have Yes Bank, you have ICICI Bank. All of them have their own backend system. They all program their own systems, and ultimately they all provide the same functionality. So on a philosophical level, you can pretty much say that all of their teams have created the same piece by putting up different number of hours at individual companies. With composability, you can assume now I have created a backend system, and all these three companies use the same backend system to create their applications. So it's a common infrastructure which anyone on top of can build on. So it's the composability basically means that, and because of that, now it exponentially increases the innovation, because as a developer, if you build something, as a next developer, I can just pick up whatever you built and can innovate on that. I don't have to spend the same time building the same thing you have built. And that way, like, you are always going up the ladder.
And this is working because everything is basically open source, like the entire.
Exactly.
So I can see what you've built and I can just build on top of that instead of building from scratch.
Exactly.
Okay. I'm going to, for today, I'm sure in a bit, our audience is going to get tired and start losing attention. So I'm going to talk about something more exciting, very exciting, which everybody is like, how do I do mining? Can I do mining in India? What's my bottleneck? What does it cost? How do I get started? Can you say something about that?
Yeah, sure. So technically, mining anyone can do from their laptop. Practically, it is not going to be profitable. So it would have been profitable for Ethereum probably 2 years back. It would have been profitable for Bitcoin probably 4 years back. But because of the competition, there are two components of doing mining successfully or profitably. First is the fixed cost. So you need specialized machines. So mining basically means you need high computation power. So machines who are highly optimized for the computation which Bitcoin requires specifically. Your laptop is built for multi-purpose use cases. So it is not optimized for this single kind of computation. So there are ASICs devices which you need to buy. It might cost anywhere from $2,000 to probably a couple of $1,000, $5,000, $10,000, depending on the machines. So that comes your fixed cost. Also, like since every 3 year or 4 year you are innovating on these machines, you can pretty much assume you are going to have new machines every 4 years. So that becomes your recurring cost. And the second cost becomes is the electricity cost. So whenever you are doing computation, your machines require energy, it requires electricity. So depending on where you live, electricity cost can impact hugely your profitability. The third thing which impacts mining is the environment, the weather. So whenever you are using these machines, they get heated up and you need to cool them down. So naturally, if you are living in a place which is cold places like mountains, etc., you might need less resources. As a result, like it might be more profitable to do mining there.
Okay, so and that is basically also related to electricity cost, right?
Yeah.
So what would you say is the benchmark if I want to mine Bitcoin or Ether? You know, what should my electricity cost per unit before I can even dream of being profitable?
So I don't have the exact number, but last I checked in China, the numbers were probably 1/5 of what we have in India, 1/5 or 1/10 of what we have in India. So imagine like on a global scale, you are going to compete with those people. So like ultimately it's a open source competition, like whoever has the cheapest electricity, they are going to be most profitable. Having said that, very recent narrative has been China was not known for clean energy. So now the theme is going towards clean energy. And now people who use solar energy or wind energy, like that might become a huge use case for mining. So personally, I have traveled to Himalayas for an example, and a lot of villages are actually surviving on solar energy. And in solar energy, what happens is like you are never storing the energy, like whatever you are producing, you have to just consume it or it is going to waste. But we can come up with models in which it doesn't go to waste. Whenever you are producing extra electricity, you can put it to mining. So that way, like even it can adopt or it can accelerate the solar movement as well, like across the globe. So clean energy could be one of the side effect of the blockchain.
This is the argument that Cathie Wood, I think, has recently made in the conversation with Elon Musk.
Yep,
right?
Yep.
That okay. Still, so let's just say, is it what, 5 cents? Is that what we're talking about? 5 cents per unit? 6 cents
so
per unit?
actually, I don't even remember what is the electricity cost in India. So what's the electricity cost in India?
So it depends, right? Residential could cost you 7 rupees to 10 rupees a unit. So that's almost 10 to 15 cents.
Okay, so I think it should be fine at 1 to 2 rupees a unit.
Okay, all right. And so if you buy one machine, all right, could you still make money? How often? So it's almost like a bingo competition, right? Like it's you're trying. It's not like you're running, you constantly getting some Bitcoin, right? It could be that you'll make 1 Bitcoin every 3 days. Is that how that works? So with one machine, how often could I expect to make a coin?
So it's a probabilistic game at the mathematical level. So I have this very simple explanation of like explaining mining to people. So and the whole blockchain in itself. So imagine like there are 10 people sitting around a table. Each of them have a piece of paper, a piece of A4 sheet paper. And you can line 50 lines in that piece of paper. That means you can write 50 transactions in that piece of paper. So that means every piece of paper has a limit in terms of number of transactions. Imagine this piece of paper is a block. So as soon as like 50 transactions are completed, you need the next piece of paper to fill up the next transactions. Now to find the next piece of paper, imagine you are in a house and someone told you like piece of paper, there are different pieces of paper and they are hidden at random places in that house. So all you have to do is like you have to just randomly start searching, and one of you become lucky and find that piece of paper. So whoever find the piece of paper first, they get the mining reward, and then everyone can write transaction in that piece of paper. So it's the same thing now in the computer language. It's a string which you need to find, and the only way to find is basically by randomly just trying whether this could be the string or whether this could be the string. And one of the lucky number basically comes up. Okay, like this matches the condition, and this is the string. This could be considered as the right string. As a result, like not necessarily if you ran the mining for 3 days, you might ended up finding a block or earning the mining block. Because of that, what people do is it suddenly becomes like unpredictable for everyone. So people collaborate and they build this mining pool in which we decide like all of us are going to dedicate our computation power to this pool. Whatever rewards we will get, we will equally distribute depending on how much power we all individually give. So that way now you bring predictability to it.
And this can be done remotely, or this has to be
Yeah, this can be done remotely.
Oh, so you could set up a machine and join a pool.
Exactly.
From anywhere in the world.
Exactly.
Oh, that's okay. That's how you get like more predictability in your.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. All right. I'm going to, for this one, I'm going to be, there's going to be just one last question. And I think it's very clear we'll have to do multiple episodes to unpack everything you've talked about. Just one quick one. This is a question somebody posted on Twitter when I said I'll be speaking with you. And the question is whether you think, or we should think of crypto as a store of value or actually a transacting currency. And of course, I understand some currencies will be more store of value, some will be more transacting. But in the long run, do you think there'll be many such currencies, or most of the value will get accumulated into a few handful of currencies? What do you think?
Yeah, so first of all, like there are probably more than 10,000 currencies, cryptocurrencies already as of this moment, as I told you. So each of these cryptocurrencies can mean something else, like they serve a different purpose. Actually, most of them won't serve any purpose, but let's say at least hundreds of them or thousands of them serve some specific purpose. So imagine it as like you are, just like you have an economy, like Apple is doing some other value and Apple has its own value as a result. Similarly, all these currencies will have their own value of providing their whatever value they are providing to the society. On the money layer, for an example, we have Ethereum, Bitcoin, Solana, all these currencies. So there is going to be a power law. So the top currency will have the maximum market share. The second one will have the smaller market share, and probably the 10th one will have probably 100th the market share of compared to the first one. So there is going to be a power law. Similarly, that thing is going to apply in all of the individual use cases. For an example, in lending and borrowing, there will be the most power will be accumulated by the top first two protocols, then it will keep going down as a waterfall system. And that's how like all of the networks are going to get built. There will be power law in each of these individual segments. So that is how it is going to be. So it does not mean that only 5 currencies are going to be really big. There can still be like thousands of currencies who are going to be big. One of them can represent the money itself. That could be like a $10 trillion or $100 trillion kind of a market cap currency. One can mean just the social layer, like Facebook or Twitter, for an example, and they could mean like just a $1 trillion market cap. And some could be more micro specific use cases. Let's say something is just usable within Mumbai city. So that will be like smaller compared to the rest of the world.
Okay. So from an investment strategy, this is almost like a venture capital outcome, right? If I'm investing, I will have to spread out my bets and then maybe try to find some sort of edge to figure out who's going to win this.
Yeah, so for most people who have not read enough about blockchains, I will strongly recommend just, by the way, this is not financial advice, but I'll recommend just keeping their assets into Bitcoin and Ethereum. Once you hold them and you start reading more about them, I think the next stage could be for people to understand decentralized finance, because that's where they can see numbers which they can compare to the counter traditional world as well, like lending, borrowing kind of businesses, payments kind of businesses. And then there is like going to be NFT segment, which is going to be really, really widespread depending on use cases. I think we are very early in the NFT space right now, and most of the people will not actually understand what is happening, and it will still take time to shape that up.
All right. Thanks. Well, this has been real fun. And on your last note, I think we are going to get you back very soon to talk about decentralized finance and what you are doing with Mesh Finance. Rohit, thanks so much today for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me, Pari.
All right. Bye.